Hi everyone, welcome to Bluecoat. I apologise we just had a few technical glitches at the start there, but I'm very glad you're all joining us for tonight's conversation. My name is Adam Lewis Smythe and I'm Senior Curator at Bluecoat, and tonight we're very pleased to welcome Suki Chan and Anil Seth. Suki is a London-based artist and film director. Her films take audiences on immersive journeys and shine a light on subjects that are underrepresented across the human condition, from dementia, sight loss, identity to belonging. Chan's passion is to change perception and build empathy for other people's realities. And these are all themes which are really very present in her current exhibition at Bluecoat, which is called Conscious, and is open until this Sunday, the 12th of June, along with Where the Arts Belong, a group exhibition of 8 artists who have worked in residence at a dementia care home in Crewe, and that also includes Suki Chan. Anil Seth is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex. He's co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Programme on Brain, Mind and Consciousness, a European Research Council Advanced Investigator, and editor-in-chief of the academic journal Neuroscience of Consciousness. He's published several books, including 30-Second Brain in 2014, Brain Twisters in 2015, and Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, published by Faber and Faber in 2021. Suki and Anil will talk for around 45 minutes tonight, and then we'll open the conversation to questions. And if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll read the questions out at the end, but please do just type these questions in as soon as you think of them. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of a conversation and forgetting a burning question that you had 5 minutes into the conversation. So I'll hand over now to Suki and Anil, and I'll return at the end to ask some of your questions to them. And I'll also share a few more ways that you can engage with Suki's work for those of you who are unable to make it to our exhibition, and others of you who will have seen the exhibition but just want to know more about Suki's work and find some more ways to engage with her practice. So over to you, Suki and Anil.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Anil. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me tonight about your ideas, your new book. To start, I'd like to talk about working with scientists, how our paths crossed, and how I became interested in your research. We've been in email contact since 2018. I met you in 2019, just before the pandemic. But I've been aware of your work since a lot earlier than that. I think maybe since 2015, when I was researching for my Lucida project, which is a project exploring vision, perception, and the brain. And it's something that I developed with a neurobiologist called Colin Blakemore and an experimental psychologist called Kevin O'Regan. And I think it was in the research into embodied cognition and the sensory motor theory that I came across your work, and in particular controlled hallucinations. It's taken me a few years to absorb this concept and be aware of this in the background, and then now thinking about it a lot more in the last few months. And then in the time in between, I've been working with people who hallucinate as a result of dementia. And this was a complete surprise to me because I didn't know that that dementia can cause hallucinations. So I've been thinking about hallucinations in that context of a cognitive disease where there is still stigma surrounding it, and then hallucinations within perception itself, and what those differences are. But firstly, I think it would be nice for us to perhaps talk about the intersection of art and science, how you have found working with artists, as you've collaborated with a number of artists in the past.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and just thank you for inviting me for this conversation this evening. And I've really enjoyed our interactions, and I was lucky to have a chance to see Conscious, the exhibition at the Bluecoat, a couple of weeks ago when I was in the north of England, and it's really beautiful and moving and profound and quite unique as well. I thought the setting. I won't spoil. We'll talk more about it, I'm sure later on, because I also want to know how that unfolded for you. But it's a very, very powerful, I think, window onto a very central aspect of who we are. My book is called Being You and so on, but our memories are pretty fundamental to who we are. But I suppose also they're not everything. And I think that's one of the interesting things, that there's much more about us than any one dimension, be it memory or volition or the body that we happen to have and all these things. Anyhow, I'm already just rambling and diverting, but I think the experience of working with artists, it actually started, and I hope you forgive me for this, it started with a moment of frustration a little bit, because about 10 years ago, I was already had a position in a lab here at Sussex, and I was beginning to do a bit of public engagement and art science collaborations. And the reason I was doing it was I found it fun. I mean, it's just nice, it's good to do fun things, but also providing a different perspective on what I was interested in. I'm interested in the nature of conscious experience, the nature of subjectivity, and of course, art is always exploring what is the nature of our subjective experience. What does it mean for a subject to encounter the world? And so in visual perception, for instance, which is a lot of what we do in the lab, typically in the lab, we might do experiments where we flash a light on a screen and then another light a little bit later and get people to push a button and draw conclusions, very useful conclusions about how the visual system works and how conscious perception happens. But that's so far away from the richness of our everyday experience with people and places and objects, and art sheds light on these richer aspects of experience or phenomenology in a way that science is not there yet. So it's going at the same phenomenon from two directions. But the frustration was that I remember being at this meeting in Brighton, where I live, and it was sort of bringing artists and scientists together. And there was just this sort of, it was chaired by, I can't remember who any of these people are now, so I can't even, but there was this sort of blanket assumption that, yes, the art projects benefit from the scientific interactions in some way. It may just be like they provide some phenomena that provide some artistic inspiration, like, here's a cell, isn't it amazing? Let's do some art based on a cell. And then it was just said, and the science also benefits, like, the scientific work is advanced through the art. And it was just sort of, and I said, actually, no, I've never experienced that happening. That would be lovely if it does, but at that point, I'd never experienced that happening. And maybe that shouldn't be the objective. That's, I think, a bit of a narrow view, assumption of what this intersection between art and science should be. It's not that we directly, it can do, and in later years it has done provide data, and there's some more direct things too. But really, I think it's a more fundamental connection. Art and science are both, at essence, creative windows onto some phenomenon that we want to understand in greater depth, and that's where the true value of the interaction lies.
Yeah, for me, it's been so fascinating talking with a number of scientists, and quite often I find that a lot of scientists are inspired by science fiction movies like Blade Runner, and then I realized that I myself have been influenced by these films as well. I think my experience of working with scientists has been that, luckily for me, I think it's been two-way. It hasn't been me gleaning information and illustrating scientific concepts, because I think that for me would be a little bit one-dimensional. Yeah. It's that I think for me it needs to form the core of the work. But I think we're also very similar in that I think we're exploring really big questions about life, and we spend an extraordinary amount of time, devoting to this exploration. So I find that we're actually very, very similar. We have different tools, and we have a different angle, like you said. We have a different outcome. Is it a film? Is it a paper? Is it etc.? These are quite fundamental in that it will then develop in a different way. So yeah, it's been great, and I mean, could you perhaps talk about how you became interested in the subject of consciousness, and was there anything in your early years that prompted you to think very deeply about this subject?
Sure, but yeah, I first just wanted to say that, of course, I think in the interactions with you for the work that you've done, the other ones, that it really has been two-way, but from exactly the angle we're talking about, Conscious, your current exhibition, for me, I think illustrates this beautifully, because you can study dementia and memory loss in the clinic, in the lab, and understand exactly how memory is affected, which brain regions might be implicated, how people's abilities to do things is affected as a result. But what you don't get is what that means for the person, and what that might mean for the interactions between that person and those close to them. You don't get that fundamental relevance of all these other things. And I think that's what your art and other great art like that provides an essential part of the whole picture that just doesn't come easily through any other way. And when it comes to consciousness, this everyday miracle, we're made of stuff, yet we have conscious experiences to light up our lives, and sometimes make them problematic as well. We experience joy and suffering throughout our lives, but we're just pieces of biological meat. How and why anything made of anything, whether it's silicon chips or biological neurons, could have a conscious experience at all, is still one of the most fundamental mysteries, I think, in science and philosophy. But it happens. It's a very accessible mystery. It's here. For me, the interest went back to when I was a child. And I think many of us, when we're very young, we have these questions, these big questions. Who am I? Why am I me and not someone else? What will happen when I die? And then immediately, well, where was I before I was born? And a lot of us just end up thinking about something else after a while and doing something else for a living. And I studied many things, but this fundamental nagging question was just stayed with me. And looking back, I can now sort of see what I was doing as circling around it in various ways for many years. And then being lucky enough to work in academia at a time where the neuroscience and psychology of consciousness was no longer considered disreputable or this fringe weird thing, but rightly so, one of the central phenomena that we should be interested in when we're looking at how the mind and brain work. And so I've been very, very lucky, I think. And because it's a subject that many of us, it's important to all of us, I think, whether we realize it or not. And many of us realize it in different ways. And there has been, it's one of those subjects where, I was a bit worried in science it would become so specialized as you sort of move through the career that you'd end up knowing everything about something nobody else cared about. And it's been a great relief that it hasn't turned out that way. But I think it does depend on the topic, and the topic of consciousness is very, very broad, that there are so many intersections with other people interested in the same things, but from very, very different angles, like art, like theater, like the film, and so on. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, because it's still quite rare, I think, for artists to have such close interactions with scientists in their work. And as you say, a lot of it does seem to be, here's an artistic depiction of a phenomenon. Here's a way to represent or convey a finding artistically. Or here's just an artistic product that was inspired by it. Whereas this seems to be a deeper interaction. So yeah, how did your career sort of progress in this direction towards this quite deep entanglement?
I think I wanted to understand perception, and we reached out to Colin Blakemore, and he was very, very kind to spend a lot of time chatting to me and enabling me to understand that our brains construct our sense of reality. And I think there were a series of penny dropping moments it was often between talking to Colin and then speaking with Kevin O'Regan that the penny dropped, because they would often say very similar things, but in a different way. And somehow that enabled me to understand that we all have this inner model of reality. And then I guess from then on, I'm hooked. I want to understand more about how we construct this reality, and if what we understand and perceive of reality is really what is out there. And I think that's been the central theme of my work in the past 8 years. And I think had I not done that project about vision, perception, and the brain, Lucida, I don't think I would even attempt to begin a project about consciousness. Very early on, when I went to this, it was like an international conference about vision and perception that all these scientists around the world descend upon. And I went to sit in the conferences and then chatted with the scientists. And I spoke to one scientist and I told him that I was doing an art project about perception. He looked at me and said, "Good luck." I think
how
about
did you take that?
now,
What do you think he meant? Yeah, what was that about?
It's huge. I mean, how are we going to do a project about perception, right? I mean, and that's something that you think about. Well, how do I approach this massive subject? What can I bring to it, or what are the questions that I'm interested in? But I wonder what would he say now if I say to him, well, actually, I'm doing an art project about consciousness, which is even bigger, right? So I think there's always a way in. And I think what I love about your book is the way that you bring us in on a very personal level. You give us the real world framework for which we can then inhabit that space and then go, oh, wow, this is quite amazing. And I think that ability to really zoom out of the information that we know and then to present it in a way that people can understand and engage with is really key. So when you talk about anesthesia, your experience of undergoing anesthesia and how that loss of consciousness is different from going to sleep, for example, you have no concept of time having passed. I totally understood that, having had that experience myself. And I think it's those sharing of stories that you can have a very meaningful dialogue.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's probably easier thing to do with the subject of consciousness than in other things. Like if you're writing about black holes, that's quite hard to make very, very personal. But of course, we're all intimately familiar with this topic of consciousness, even if we have no idea about the philosophy or the science at all. Simply through direct acquaintance, we've all fallen asleep and woken up. We've all experienced emotions. We all experience what we think of as free will. We all experience being an individual. So there's an immediate connection, and it matters to us, right? Conscious experiences matter to us. In fact, probably nothing else matters. Things only matter in as much as they manifest in the experiences that we have. That's one of the things about general anesthesia. Nothing matters when you're under anesthesia, which is a good thing when you're being operated on. But you could equally describe that's what a state of profound unconsciousness is. It's a state in which there is no mattering and no minding, I suppose, as well. But yeah, I think it's maybe that's why there's rich territory for art and science intersections in this topic, because there's a similar angle that one can take. You were talking about Lucida and the visual hallucinations that people with dementia have, and I think again that was a beautiful project, in part because when people think about dementia or other kinds of diseases like Parkinson's disease, people tend to think about what it is they can't do. These people can no longer remember things, or can no longer walk smoothly, make smooth movements in the case of Parkinson's disease. But there are all sorts of changes on the inside too, hallucinations in particular, and people with dementia have hallucinations. People with Parkinson's disease, I didn't know this until not that long ago, also have vivid visual hallucinations of different sorts. And one of the projects that we're working on in my lab now at the moment is we're trying to use computer models to simulate different kinds of hallucinations. So like I had this video I used in a lot of my talks of like dogs emerging everywhere out of Sussex campus by basically modeling the visual system and running it backwards and saying predict dog everywhere. And that turns out to be an interesting model of that's something like a psychedelic hallucination. But we've been refining that model now to try and come up with matches to other kinds of hallucinations. But how do we know whether we're right or not? Well, what we do is actually take the model to people with these conditions and ask them to pick, to guide us through the space of possible hallucinations until they say, yeah, that's what it's like for me. And in that way, we can start to understand the basis not only of their behavioral and functional deficits, but of the changes to their inner lives too. And again, I think that's a perspective that art is really good at getting at, and your Lucida project was really wonderful at getting at.
I think that ability to share your hallucinations is really key, and quite often that's what happens with dementia, that there is this breakdown in communication. So it's very easy for the rest of us to say, oh, that person is hallucinating, and for them that experience is very real, but they can't often talk about it, whereas we can confer and say, well, this is the reality that we both experience. And so I think it's great that you're bringing people in and saying, well, is it like this? Because I think then there is a two-way dialogue that is really supportive of the changes that are happening inside the brain under these cognitive diseases.
So because one question I wanted to ask you, so when I was, one of the stories I use in the book a little bit, and I did check with my mother because it's about my mother, but she, a few years ago, had a series of neurological issues, which meant that she developed delirium, which I'd never heard of. But delirium is this very common term in hospitals, hospital-induced delirium. It sounds very Victorian, doesn't it? But it's because the understanding has not really progressed since then, unfortunately. But it's a condition, usually temporary, where people who generally have lots of other things going wrong with them also develop vivid hallucinations. And I remember talking to my mum in hospital, and she was convinced of all these things that just were not happening, people crawling up the walls and out of the windows and running up and down the corridors, different very specific descriptions of different kinds of people from different countries. And this was quite terrifying to her. And there was a point at which I was wondering how best to engage with her. And none of the scientific training I had is any use in this situation. There's a choice. Do you say, no, look, it's not happening, don't worry, that's not happening, that's just your brain, it's not happening, or do you go with them and say, yeah, that's fine, don't worry, I see them, but they'll be gone soon. And I sort of vacillated between the two things, because every day would be a clean slate in the sense that it didn't seem to matter. I didn't really know what to do, and I was just struck by how impotent the sort of mechanistic understanding of hallucinations was in the face of that kind of personal encounter. And I'm just wondering, when you were dealing with the people that you were interviewing and talking to, both for Conscious and for Lucida, how far do you go into their worlds?
As far as they allow you to. So I think the advice that I was given would be to go along with that, because that is very real to them. And then talk about it. One lady had, and I learned this through Wendy Mitchell as well, who is someone who lives with dementia and is able to articulate her experiences, and she develops coping mechanisms. She was helping a friend who kept on seeing this man inside her house. Sometimes it would be a leg hanging out of a wardrobe door that's slightly ajar, an arm hanging out of a cupboard. It was very frightening to her, because it was someone that she didn't recognize, and he would just appear in her home. And then Wendy would say, well, have you given him a name? Give him a name. And then through time, she then developed a way of talking to this man that kept on appearing, or, you know, or just go away and slamming the door shut, that kind of thing. And I think in a way, it's better to offer that kind of interaction rather than correcting them and saying,
yeah,
well, that's not there, you're not really seeing that, my love, you know. And because then I think you're reducing that person to, again, that sort of inadequacy of not knowing what really is real and not real, and being confused. I think quite often people don't like being called confused, because it de-skills them, and it can really take away their independence.
Reminds me of this. There's this therapy for psychosis. So of course, schizophrenia is another condition where people have hallucinations, sometimes visual, but also auditory, and I think more commonly auditory hallucinations, voices in the head, and so on. And I can't remember the name of the guy who pioneered this, or quite how far it's got, but the concept made a lot of sense, and it's along these lines. So instead of denying the hallucination, you say, no, this is, let's try and figure out exactly what it's like for you. So they would develop this virtual reality avatar character that represented this, was a close match to this person's description of whoever they were hallucinating, or the voice and so on. And so it made it more real rather than less real, paradoxically. But then given that, the avatar could gradually change its behavior and start saying nice things and supportive things, rather than the usual angry, self-critical verbiage that these patients often suffer. And at least in the cases, that the early days of this, the papers I remember reading from a few years ago, this in some cases did seem to work. And so it's not that these people stopped hallucinating, it's just that their hallucinations became much less distressing. And this does connect. There's a colleague of mine, Charles Ferneyhoff, who's done a great deal of work on auditory hallucinations in general. And it turns out that it's really not uncommon for people to hear voices that are not there. It's just there's an understandable disinclination to report that this is going on, for fear of being categorized as having psychosis or requiring medication, or being locked away or something. But it's really not that uncommon, and for many people it's not distressing. It's just part of life. And I also didn't know. I found that absolutely fascinating. I think it speaks to there's a much more variety in the way we experience the world than we recognize just by what people say and how they behave.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you feel like you're the only weirdo in the room that's having these experiences, that's not a great place to be. I think when you feel like it's shared somehow, you're less distressed. And I think it is that action of making it less distressing that's quite key. And I wonder whether we could talk more about controlled hallucinations, because it seems to be a very key idea of your theories, but it's also for me, very empathetic as well. It creates a leveler that we're all hallucinating. It's not just people with cognitive diseases that are hallucinating. That's quite a key thing for me.
I'm really glad that you see that, because it actually gets a lot of pushback, this idea. And the problem with the term, any kind of short, snappy slogan, is that it's not the whole story. It's inaccurate in many ways, but you've got to use something. So the basic idea, we have been talking about it a bit already. So the basic idea is it's a way of thinking about our perceptual experience that has very old roots in philosophy, back to Plato and Kant, and in psychology to Helmholtz in the late 19th century. And a basic way to understand it is that it might seem as though when we perceive the world visually, let's say, we just open our eyes and there's a world out there, and it pours information in through our eyes, and it gets read out somewhere in the brain, and the self is there, and it reads all this information out, and it reads it accurately, and there's a world. So perception happens in this sort of outside in direction. But the other way, and I think the more accurate way of thinking about perception, is really the stuff that's hitting our sensory receptors, whether they're eyes or ears or nose, is quite indirectly related to what's actually out there in the world. And to make sense of sensory information, the brain is always making predictions about what caused the sensory signals. So this is why it goes back to Plato and the allegory of the cave, that all the prisoners chained to the walls of the cave, all they see are the shadows cast by firelight, but they take those shadows to be the real world because they have no direct access to the world beyond the cave. And in modern neuroscience, that's just rephrased as saying the brain is always throwing out these predictions about what's out there in the world, and then the sensory signals that come in, they don't really get read out. They just calibrate these predictions. They're prediction errors. They keep the brain's best guesses tied to the world, but not necessarily in terms of accuracy, but in how useful they are for the organism. So, Anais Nin said, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. Our perceptual universes are constructed to be useful, not to be accurate, although that involves some overlap. And that's why the control is important, because a lot of people just pick up on the hallucination bit. So I use the word hallucination because it emphasizes that what we experience really does come from the inside. And it's controlled, though, because it's controlled by sensory information coming from the world, and the control is just as important. But now you've got, as you said, you've got a spectrum. Maybe your brain changes so that it loses control. It's not updating its predictions in the same way. Your perceptual best guesses begin to lose their grip on the real world, and then you call, that's hallucination. But it's a whole continuity, and I think most of us in everyday life, we're aware of this. You look up at the sky on a cloudy day, and you might see faces in the clouds or animals. Our brains project patterns into things naturally, and that's the basis of perception. But fundamentally, it's a very, very large flip, because it seems like we're registering the world as it is through our senses. The subjective world has the character of being objective. We see with the models we have of the world, we don't see them as models. And this applies to everything. I think that the perfect example is color. Colors, seems like colors exist out there in the world, but of course they don't. Our brains are responsive to only 3 wavelengths of light, and out of those we generate this very large palette of colors, and we all see colors slightly differently. And I think it was Cézanne who said that color is where the brain and the universe meet, which is a lovely way to put it. But yeah, it's a big inversion, and for me it's been very personally affecting to sort of walk around the world and always try, not always, but every now and again just reflect on that the way I see things is not the way they are. It's a very simple point. It's not a new point. Philosophy's made it, religion has made, Buddhism has made this point forever. Art's been very well aware of this point. But to sort of live that experience and actually now find evidence for this process happening in the brain and in ways that allow us to connect all these different phenomena, like various kinds of hallucinations and delusions with normal perception, has been a fascinating adventure. But sometimes people will just say, like, no, he says you hallucinate everything, and if you think that, just go stand in front of a bus and see what happens. Of course, no, buses exist. I'm not saying that the world is made up, but just the way we encounter the world is a marvelous construction and a very useful construction of the brain and the body.
I think we don't think about it enough, and I think it's lovely to hear, listening to you say that you walk around and you think about this, because I do that as well, and it's and I think that's the issue, that when you're not aware of it and you take things at face value, then it becomes hard to understand other people who has a completely different worldview to our own, or they have a version of reality that sits at odds with ours, because we think that we perceive reality as it really is out there. We don't think about the diversity of subjective human experiences, and that we will see things differently. I think it was Tarkovsky that said that a book read by 1,000 different people is 1,000 different books. And I think your ideas are very inclusive in the way that I think when we realize that autism, for example, is on a spectrum, that completely, leveled it for other people, that it's like, I'm on the autism spectrum too. I'm just down here, and it's not maybe registering as being autistic. So I think this idea of that we all hallucinate is so powerful, and it really has that potential to really open up empathy for other people who just sits elsewhere on that spectrum, rather than this idea of them and us, and I've got the version of reality that is closer and someone else is wrong. I think we kind of get into these very restricted way of thinking.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I should also say it's not a term I came up with. I heard it from Chris Frith, who I think is another neuroscientist that you've spoken to quite a bit, and he heard it from somewhere else. And actually, we've tried to do detective work about where it first came up, and it's traced it back to, I think, like the 1920s or something now. But yeah, it's a phrase that's been around, and in fact, one of the studies that I've been working on with my group at Sussex, and we're about to launch in later this month, I think, I'm not sure exactly when, but before the end of June, it's called the Perception Census, and it's precisely an attempt to, I think, really for the first time, to map out how diverse our perceptual experiences are, because right now we do still tend to think in terms of like normal perception and then abnormal perception, whether it's hallucination or autism or some other thing. And yes, there are inclusive ways to describe that, but it's still usually with reference to like normal and weird in some inclusive way. But it's very likely that, in fact, we got to take spectrum more literally, that we all differ, and that we're just not readily aware. The only times we become aware of these differences, and even then it takes ages, like with autism, right, is when the differences are quite large. So people with synesthesia, for instance, it's large, so it becomes apparent. But even then, really hard. I mean, until recently, many people would go through their lives with synesthetic experiences, like, seeing colors when other people don't, and would never know that it was odd because we just didn't talk about it. But now with this study, we want to, through a series of it's just online experiments and surveys and things, quite simple to do, but we'll be able to get a much better handle on like how you and I might differ. We're going to see color probably differently a little bit, or experience the flow of time differently, or have different vividness of mental imagery. And, I'm hoping we will need like tens, hundreds of thousands of people to do this, but hopefully they will. And we'll learn for the first time what this inner diversity is like. And that, I really think, does help build empathy. If you really understand that the way you see things is not necessarily the way they are, or that other people have an equally, and again, you don't have to be totally relativistic. It's not that anything goes. There's a middle ground of being a little bit more humble about our own perceptions without equalizing everything and saying, anything is as good as anything else. No, there's still a ground truth out there, but we must be aware that each of us may misrepresent that in some distinctive fashion. I think art can really help challenge that as well, right? Because of course, people faced encountering an artwork, I think because of the nature of art, always take something different from it.
Yeah, that discussion of what do you see? What do you think it's about? We don't have a huge amount of time, so let's talk about your definition of consciousness, because I feel that I've been speaking to a lot of scientists about the different, how they define consciousness, and I think yours is one that I resonate with, because again, it has this ability to really open up and include other minds, including other animals, because I think quite often what we do is that we have this measure of consciousness that is very much to do with human consciousness, so we start excluding animals because they don't pass the mirror test, or because they don't use language in the way that we do, or they don't have a concept of the past or the future. So yeah, could you talk a bit about your definition of consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much lifted from a philosopher called Thomas Nagel in the 1970s, and it's one of the it's a pretty popular definition in the field to use for precisely the reasons that you say, and I quite like it. It simply says that well, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. That's the first thing. It's not specific to like language or intelligence or even sense of self. I was having a chat with a Buddhist scholar earlier today, and there's a big overlap there about the impermanence or the non-existence of the self in Buddhism, as well as in now this perspective from consciousness and neuroscience. And Thomas Nagel's definition is for a conscious creature, there is something it is like to be that creature. It feels like something to be that creature. That's all it takes. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be you. But for a table or a chair, it doesn't feel like anything to be that. Does it feel like anything to be a bat? As his paper was, what's it like to be a bat? Conclusion, probably yes, but only a bat will have access to that. And so it's an inclusive definition. It's very broad, but definitions in science and philosophy are starting points. They're going to evolve, and maybe we'll come up with a more mechanistic definition after some time, as happened in other areas of science, like heat became defined as things feeling hot or cold to molecules moving very fast in a substance, and that was heat. Maybe, and there are some proposals for more mechanistic definitions of consciousness. I don't think we're there yet, so I prefer to use it still descriptively as a phenomenon that's not restricted to human beings, because I think that's just hubris and a residue of this always disappointingly present human anthropocentrism and exceptionalism, where we measure everything with respect to our presupposed distinctiveness. But again, it's not that everything is the same. No doubt we have more complex language than other species. But then if you look at the visual working memory of a monkey, it's phenomenal. Their visual awareness is probably much richer than ours. So yeah, we all inhabit a space, a point, or a region in the space of possible minds. That would be a definition.
And do you think we'll ever explain away the mystery of consciousness to the point where it is mechanistic, like we think of temperature? Or
this is such a good question. I think it's possible. What I think is the most likely to happen, I think what is already happening, is the sense of mystery will dissolve a bit and will certainly change. And that's progress. So it's, at the moment, it still feels like consciousness is this one single big mystery. And we might need some really radical solution to figure out how brains give rise to consciousness. Now, this may be the case, but it may not be the case. And it may be that as we understand more about how different aspects of biology underlie different aspects of consciousness, like aspects of my visual experience compared to emotion, compared to the experience of free will, and why these different experiences have the character that they do and are not like something else, that this sense of mystery will begin to dissolve and fade away. And that's what happened in another of the big mysteries of science, which was life. Life at one point was considered also inexplicable in terms of mechanisms. We needed an élan vital, spark of life, but that didn't happen. Life is, we don't understand everything, but it doesn't have that sense of mystery anymore. We just think, it's complex stuff happening in ways that haven't fully been unraveled yet. But also, life didn't turn out to be like temperature. It's not that we say, oh yes, life is the whatever, this thing is identical to life. No, life turns out to be many things, expressed in many different ways. There's gray areas between the living and the non-living, viruses and things like that, for instance. So for me, it's really not clear whether, as our understanding of the neurobiology of consciousness advances, whether it will veer more towards the temperature side of things or the life side of things. And for me, that's, well, depending on which day you ask me, it's frustrating or exciting.
Great, thanks. I'm as the project at Blue Coat comes to an end, I'm now moving forwards with the research and the films that's been made. I'm going to draw on this material to develop a feature film, and it's lovely to have Anil on board. Would love to show a teaser for this feature film. So if Louis, you could have it on now, that would be great. I think he's still here.
Yeah.
On a bad day, it's like a fog descends on the brain. My reality suddenly becomes a different reality.
If anything, I feel life has become easier. I'm thankful to say. I'm not afraid. It seems odd to say that I've lost any fear I ever had.
What it must be like for the person with dementia. If we only knew, it would make life easier.
Given what we know about the intimate dependency of the brain and consciousness, when your brain stops, you stop. But is this something to be afraid of? In a way, almost the opposite, because the thing about oblivion is there's nothing. Nothing to be frightened of.
Great, let's open out to questions. Adam, if you would like to read out some of the questions that we've received via the chat.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you both also for the conversation. That was really enlightening, and yeah, I really enjoyed. I feel like I got loads from that. I think just before I kind of, I will read out questions, but I'm just going to jump in with one just because the end of that trailer kind of segues into something that I had on my mind, which is a question for both of you about fear, and fear kind of came up a few times in the conversation. So Anil, you kind of spoke a little bit about people's fear of being kind of categorized with psychosis when they kind of talk more openly about their lived experience and their experience of hallucinations, and also the kind of terror of delirium. And it's something I've always kind of wondered about, people who kind of really go into the kind of detail of sort of unraveling how we think and how we perceive. That's always in itself seemed something kind of quite terrifying to me. And yeah, I wanted to kind of ask both of you, you know, as you kind of unravel the kind of layers of consciousness and what it means to be conscious, are there moments where both you as from a scientific perspective and also from an artistic perspective, that becomes kind of quite frightening, where actually it's difficult to kind of look objectively as this thing, but actually, you know, it's something that we all relate to kind of so strongly. So yeah, does I mean, sorry, that's a very personal question, but does fear kind of play a role in your work?
And you can go first.
You're on mute.
Mute mistake, sorry about that. Well, it certainly crops up, and I think for some of the reasons that you say, I think for me that the way fear appears in the course of what I do is this recognition of the precarity of our lives. When you're healthy, when you're well, you take things for granted. You open your eyes and there's a world. You take that for granted. You take the ability to go about your normal life pretty much for granted, whether it's a good day or a bad day. You take being able to remember things for granted. And to recognize what a complex feat of biological engineering underlies these things which happen without any effort, and how easily this machinery can be disrupted, that is quite scary.
I follow along those lines. We have a very precarious grip on our bodies and minds, and I often think about the loss of my own consciousness one day. If I wasn't able to remember who I am or remember who my loved ones are, what would life be like, and how might we prepare for that moment? I think it's something that we don't really think about. And going back to Anil's first experience as an 8-year-old, where he had that existential moment of thinking about his experience of being him and how one day that's going to die, I think we don't think about that very much in life in general. So it's interesting that he thought about it when he was 8, and then teenage years, nothing. We kind of live our lives as if we're invincible. So I think something that I like to do with my art is just to remind people of the losses and what might be like if we were to lose certain things. So that's something that I'm really preoccupied with at the moment. Not to be all doom and gloom, but just to think about it and then live. But if we don't think about it, then it's pretty horrendous when it does happen and you're totally unprepared and you haven't really thought about it.
And do you think almost also that there's this suppressed fear of it if you don't allow a space to think about it? We kind of think about it anyway, but we just don't acknowledge the fact, and so that it can become even more of a powerful negative aspect of our lives. And yeah, I mean, Western society is really distinctive for not talking about death, right? And this has been pointed out by so many people so many times.
Yep.
And it's not that we blithely don't ever think about it, it's just we don't talk about it, and that's not healthy.
Yeah, I think when it becomes a shared fear, it's so much easier to deal with.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with it as an individual on your own, it's very difficult. I think when my dad before he died, he kind of said, where he would like to be buried, and actually within Chinese tradition, we have this idea of telling our loved ones what we want to be wearing when we're in the coffin. So those conversations, those dialogues about sharing something that is really, really vulnerable. We feel so vulnerable talking about our death, but actually being able to share that is so empowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I suppose one of the things you mentioned early on, Anil, is one of the great things that art does, and in particular Suki's work does, is it tells us about how that person feels about it. And that's moments where you can make a real kind of connection. And I think something that's really powerful in your work, Suki, is that you can really feel the kind of, it's not like a cold objective study. There's a warmth to everyone that you work with. The relationships are kind of apparent in there with how honest and open people are being when they speak in your films.
And there's like a hope as well. There's a note of hope there, and just in that clip that we had in the beautiful trailer was from that amazing woman. I forget her name. One of the subjects in Conscious, right? And who
Wendy
said life has got easier, if anything, and I've lost all fear, and to hear that. Now, it's not what you would expect necessarily, right? But to hear that from the first person, that's extremely reassuring.
Yeah.
There was a wonderful conversation between Suki and Wendy a few weeks ago, which is now on our YouTube channel, I think. Do look that up, because it is that human connection, I think, is just is really one of the things that makes Suki's work so powerful, I think. So we got one question for Anil, which is, has your research taken you into the territory of the unconscious capitalized? So I think is that referring to the Freudian theory of the unconscious, I think?
I guess that's how I'd interpret it, as sort of, as a very nominative like that. So the short answer is not really. The longer answer is, I think sort of Freud's concepts have been a little bit unfairly sort of ostracized from modern neuroscience, partly because so much was built on them that turned out to be really not that well founded, that it just became rather taboo to even talk about at all. But of course, there are nuggets of truth there. There are nuggets of truth about emotions that we are not aware of having, of thoughts, desires that remain below the level of consciousness. But and it's pretty central to a lot of Freud as well, is how the body underpins a lot of our sense of self and consciousness. So in that sense, yes, it's there, and the unconscious is there in another sense, that in a much less Freudian sense, that a lot of what goes on in our brains doesn't end up shaping our conscious experiences at all. We can perceive things and act on them without being conscious of them whatsoever. There's still a very open question, the extent to which this happens and how much it can affect us. But it's a standard kind of methodology in what I do to compare conscious and unconscious perception and look at the difference. That will give us clues of some of the fingerprints of consciousness in the human brain. But yeah, I have to be just straight. There's not a very clear extension of Freudian ideas here, but I think now they're being rehabilitated a bit, but on the more general level of the importance of the body and in the sense of self and of sort of bodily self-preservation and all these things, rather than the sort of ego, superego divisions, which I don't really deal with.
The question, Anil, I think you can see these Q&A in the Q&A box as well. So this is kind of prefaced with a little note that the person asking the question has a brother in California with Parkinson's, and a link for you to follow on if you're looking for people to work with. My dad's also got Parkinson's, and I think few of the things we touched on about the way that Parkinson's kind of affects consciousness, there's a whole fascinating world within there that I think, like you, I hadn't kind of realized that some of those, that there are forms of dementia, there are forms of hallucination that are kind of very connected with Parkinson's. So Lisa kind of then follows on to ask about sort of, how these hallucinations are part of consciousness and how do we embrace this? And I guess, I think that idea that you picked up on in your conversation as well, you kind of touched on this a little bit about hallucinations not just being something abnormal, but being something that is part of, regular experience for a lot of people. I think that's something that is maybe sort of new to me. And I sort of wonder, as well as sort of how we embrace that idea, whether there are things within the public kind of understanding of consciousness. Is there if there's one thing that you wish that the public kind of understood about consciousness, what would that be? I guess to kind of follow on with, how do we embrace that particular aspect of that hallucinations are part of consciousness? And to follow on, I want to know kind of if there's one thing that the public should know about consciousness, what would that be?
I think that's the idea of embracing hallucinations being part of consciousness. That's something I think Suki and I would talk about a bit already, and I think it is recognizing that there is this continuity between normal in scare quotes, because we're all different anyway, perception and hallucination. It's the same thing happening. It's just unfolding in a different way, again, without sort of being completely relativistic about it, because hallucinations become problematic when they become dangerous or distressing to a person, which can of course happen. but they are indeed as much part of consciousness as normal experience is part of consciousness. And one way to embrace it as well is to and I think this is happening more, mentioned with the Hearing Voices project of Charles Ferneyhoff, to recognize that there are plenty of people who have hallucinations that are not distressing or dangerous, and therefore, but don't talk about them for, back to fear again, for fear of being categorized. But that there's just this whole spectrum of how, you know, we will vary a little bit in the balance of how much our brains bring to an experience, and that's part of life. It's part of consciousness. If there's one thing the public should know about consciousness, I honestly can't answer that. I don't know. Lots of things. I don't know. Sorry, I'm gonna punt that.
That's fine. Yeah, I've thrown you a medicine ball there, haven't I? Okay. So Gav's got a question about overlaps between neuroscience, knowledge perception, consciousness, and artificial intelligence, and whether those things will ever overlap. Will a digital entity ever have a subjective sense of humor, for instance?
Oh, by the way, I meant to say, for Lisa, who asked the previous question, I'll take a note of that email, and I'll ask my researchers on that if they do want to get in touch to do that. Thank you for that. For Gav, there's a lot of overlap, but it's I'll try and keep it very short, because this area does tend to wind me up a little bit because there's so much hype spun about it. So what a story that's often told is that AI is becoming increasingly more powerful, and there'll come a point, maybe quite soon, at which it becomes conscious, if it's not conscious already. And usually this point coincides with it becoming as super intelligent compared to humans, and then also coincides with taking over the world and enslaving us in some dystopian Terminator scenario. And this is just, I don't know, this comes again from like a heady brew of science fiction and human exceptionalism and techno optimism, or opposite, techno pessimism, I don't know. But there's very little that justifies any of these things. There's no, and I'm probably a bit of an outlier here, but I do not think it is, I think it's unlikely that computers can be conscious. I'm not sure that they can't, but you know, a lot of people assume that if you just get a computer that's programmed in the right way, fast enough, maybe it will become conscious, that consciousness is independent of the thing, what a thing is made out of. If a brain made out of silicon chips, it's okay. I just don't think that's a safe assumption. Some things you can simulate, like you can simulate playing chess, and it's actually playing chess, but you simulate a weather system and it doesn't actually get wet or windy. It's just a simulation. Why should consciousness be something that simulation gives rise to the thing itself? Often people assume that it is, but it need not be. And I think there's a stronger connection between consciousness and life that to me suggests only living things can have conscious experiences. But again, I can't prove that. And I'm suspicious of anyone who takes the 100% firm position one way or the other, but that's where I would tend. But there is still an overlap that at one level, the brain can be modeled using AI systems. It's a complex network of neurons, and the AI that we have already is inspired by aspects of brain architecture. Whether it's voice recognition or image classification, it's inspired by, based on neural networks that are inspired by the brain. And so I have some collaborations with some of the main AI researchers in Canada, where we're trying to figure out what the next level of that overlap might be, because current AI is very bad at some things, like generalizing to new situations or learning things in one shot, reasoning flexibly. And the things that AI tends to be bad at tend to be the things that in us are associated with being conscious. So that gives me a clue, and as a clue, that if we want to improve AI systems, we need to start modeling those parts of the brain that are responsible for these functions that in us are associated with being conscious. And so that that to me is a very interesting overlap that's productive, but that doesn't at all rest on the idea that we're building a conscious computer. And I really don't think we should even try to do that, because if you should, by some opposite of a miracle, disaster, succeed, then you've got one of the largest ethical catastrophes on your hands ever. You've generated a whole lot of potential suffering without even the ability to recognize that you've done it. That's what, I don't know whether you interact with have you been talking to AI people at all, Suki, in your
I've been thinking about it
conversations?
a lot. I think one of the assumptions that I made very early on was that when computers become powerful, they will become conscious. And I think intelligence and consciousness are two different things. And I think that's what I resonate most with, what you're saying about bringing it back to biology. This thing, if it's alive, then it's probably useful for it to have consciousness, so that, you know, it's not really to do with intelligence. Yeah, it's something I'm thinking about, and we'll see how far it goes into the next thing. But it's interesting when you realize there's kind of the shortcuts, because I think I did that with vision and perception. I kind of use the two terms interchangeably, and I think one of those early mistakes was to think about intelligence and consciousness almost, because we're so intelligent, we're conscious, but actually consciousness is more to do with being alive, as you say. And I think that for me resonates with me much more. And then it gets rid of that hierarchy that we might have when we think human beings have a bigger brain and therefore we are more, have a special consciousness or a richer consciousness than other animals because they don't have as many neurons or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, final question from Richard, who says, William James spoke about the need for understanding consciousness by not only studying behavior and functionality, but also introspection. The first two have been studied extensively, but not so much introspection, particularly in the West. With Eastern philosophy and religion, there have been 2,500 years of people studying the mind through meditative practices. How much would that be of benefit to contemporary consciousness research?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's bang on the money in a way. I mean, the history of so William James, in the late 19th century, one of the founders of psychology, he thought consciousness was the central thing to try to understand, and of course, he relied a lot on introspection, because that's how we know about conscious experience, rather than just looking at what something does. And it was really the suspicion of this as a method that led to the tradition, the practice of behaviorism in psychology, which dominated for decades. In fact, I was taught by behaviorists in the 90s, and their claim was, well, we can only study what's publicly observable, and that's behavior and function. And but it sort of ended up as a bit of a baby throwing out with a bathwater thing. Just consciousness became not a subject within psychology, which was clearly a bit nonsense, I thought. And of course, many other people thought as well. And so since about the 90s, introspection in some form or other has become put back on the table, but in a more controlled way. I think the key thing with making introspection scientific is there are many different forms of introspection. It can be very unconstrained, but it can also be constrained, and hitting all these points is important. It can be like, how long did you think that lasted? That's a very constrained form of introspection. But equally, you can ask more open-ended questions. And then the other traditions that can contribute to this, absolutely. So even within Western traditions, there's a lot of phenomenological philosophy that will help us understand what experience is like. And I think this is absolutely critical, because it's too easy to think of consciousness as this single big mystery. Like, I'm conscious or I'm not, or a little bit. But phenomenology has really tried to understand what is the nature of lived experience. What is this thing called consciousness that we're trying to explain? What is an experience of a moment like? Things like that. And I think that gives us the explanatory targets we need in the science of consciousness so we can make progress. And then, of course, the Eastern traditions, especially traditions involving mindfulness, have been doing this for a very, very long time, as you point out, thousands of years, and recognize a lot of things that now map well onto an emerging neuroscience, like the impermanence of the self, or the illusory nature of the self. Through meditation, I think it's a very powerful method of introspection, learning to pay attention to your experiences and learning to pay attention to attention. It helps us understand what attention is too. William James was perplexed by this, focused on it a lot. So yeah, and I'm still, this is, for me, it's an area where I'm always trying to learn more. I've been involved with a number of dialogues with people from, whether they're scholars or practitioners within Buddhism and meditation, and they're always fascinating interactions, because there is so much overlap, and especially I think within these traditions, there's also an openness to what the science can offer. It's like, yeah, they're recognized as really complementary rather than one dominating the other, and that's, I think, a very fortunate situation to be in.
That's wonderful. So that's the last of our questions. Yeah, thank you both, Suki and Anil. Yeah, really wonderful conversation. And thank you for everyone who's listened and everyone who sent in their questions. And I did mention at the start that at the end of this, I'd kind of follow on with some links for how you can kind of find out more about Suki's work. And if you're unable to visit for the last week of the exhibition, but want to engage with Suki's work somehow, alongside the exhibition, Suki's also produced a virtual reality work called Fog, which is viewable on Blue Coat's YouTube channel. And you can view that with a kind of headset, but also it's navigable on the browser as well. On our YouTube channel, there's also, already mentioned it, but there's also documentation of Suki's conversation with Wendy Mitchell, who features in the films. That's a really beautiful conversation. Lots of moments in that were very moving. That's on our YouTube channel as well. And we've also just launched a new podcast series called Listening With, and that's available on Substack and also most of your usual platforms such as Spotify and iTunes. The first episode of that features Suki, and then subsequent episodes continue a kind of line of interest that kind of stems from Suki's practice and from the Conscious exhibition. Chris Frith is one of the people who have done an episode, who I know you mentioned him earlier. There's also Roger Hill is on there at the moment, who's in the Where the Arts Belong exhibition, and we'll be releasing new episodes on a weekly basis as well. So the first 3 episodes are up there at the moment. Yeah, so lots of ways to find out more and kind of go in more depth into Suki's work and some of the concerns that kind of arise from your practice, Suki. So yeah, thank you again to the speakers, and thank you to the audience, and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.